New York City is a place of constant noise. The symphony of car horns, distant sirens, and the clatter of subway trains is as much a part of its identity as the Statue of Liberty or the Empire State Building. But in late November, something shifted. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like an offbeat drum in the orchestra of urban life. Commuters first noticed it on the downtown A train, an unusual thudding sound echoing in the tunnels. At first, it was dismissed as construction or perhaps a malfunctioning train. After all, the city's infrastructure was aging, and odd noises were not uncommon. Yet this was different. The sound wasn't mechanical. It felt alive, almost deliberate. Reports trickled in across boroughs. By the week's end, every subway line had passengers claiming to hear the same rhythmic pounding. Some described it as a heartbeat, slow and steady, emanating from the depths. Others likened it to the heavy thud of footsteps, too large to belong to anything human. The most unsettling accounts came from those who waited alone on late-night platforms. They swore the sound grew louder as the stations emptied, as if the silence was coaxing it closer. The MTA denied everything. A spokesperson, pressed by journalists, chalked the noise up to the city's notorious rats and dismissed concerns as urban hysteria. "The subway is loud, chaotic, and old," she said at a press conference. "People hear what they want to hear." Her words did little to calm the public. In the weeks that followed, the sound grew bolder. It began to bleed into street-level life, audible at quiet intersections or in the early hours before dawn. Residents of high-rise apartments reported hearing it through their floors, even though they lived stories above the nearest subway tunnel. Journalists and amateur sleuths took to investigating. Audio engineers uploaded spectral analyses of the sound online, claiming its frequency didn't match anything produced by human or mechanical sources. Podcasts debated its origin, with theories ranging from sinkholes to secret government experiments. One particularly eccentric Reddit thread insisted it was the work of a subterranean ecosystem of creatures long hidden beneath the city. Theories turned to obsession for some, as online communities formed to dissect every report, every recording, and every unexplained disappearance near subway entrances. Then there was Luis Mendoza, a station manager at the 14th Street, Union Square subway hub. Mendoza had worked the MTA for 23 years and had no patience for conspiracy theories. But even he couldn't explain what he heard one fateful night during his routine shift. The station was nearly empty when the thuds began, louder than he'd ever experienced. He walked the length of the platform, shining his flashlight into the tunnel. "It felt like it was following me," he later told a co-worker, visibly shaken. "The sound wasn't just in my ears, it was in my chest like a pressure." Mendoza wasn't the only witness. That same night, an aspiring musician named Callie was waiting for the L train. She had just finished a late gig and was scrolling on her phone when the sound grew loud enough to drown out her headphones. She looked up and froze. Across the platform, where the dim lighting barely reached, she thought she saw movement. An enormous, shapeless figure that dissolved into the shadows before she could focus on it. Her mind raced with rational explanations. A trick of the light, a maintenance worker. But the unease lingered long after the train whisked her away. Despite mounting reports, city officials maintained their stance. There was nothing to fear. Their indifference only heightened public paranoia. Some subway riders took to wearing noise-canceling headphones, while others avoided the system altogether, opting for crowded buses or expensive rideshares. But for a city as vast and interconnected as New York, avoiding the subway entirely was nearly impossible. The sound became an unavoidable part of life, a grim reminder that something unknown was stirring beneath the streets. Then came a video, uploaded anonymously to YouTube. It was grainy and poorly lit, like most viral urban footage. The uploader claimed it was filmed at an abandoned section of the G line, where they had snuck in to investigate. The camera panned through graffiti-covered walls and rusted tracks before the sound began. Deep, resonant, and unnervingly close. As the camera turned, a shadow darted across the frame, impossibly large and quick. The video cut off abruptly, ending with a single word scrawled on the screen: run. The clip gained millions of views in days. News outlets debated its authenticity, but no one could confirm who had uploaded it. Meanwhile, a new pattern emerged. Those who investigated the sound too closely began to vanish. Amateur ghost hunters, freelance journalists, and even curious tourists gone without a trace. The city's usual chaos masked these disappearances at first, but as the missing persons list grew, connections became harder to ignore. By the end of the month, one thing was clear: the sound wasn't just a mystery. It was a warning, and for a city that thrived on moving fast and looking forward, New York found itself in a rare and unsettling state of hesitation. Something ancient, something hungry, was stirring, and it had chosen the city as its stage. While the city's underground became the epicenter of unease, an entirely different mystery was unfolding high above. On the rooftops of New York City, whispers began to spread. Not literal whispers, but stories, rumors, and sightings that defied easy explanation. Office workers on smoke breaks claimed to see shapes moving between water towers. Delivery workers, who made their daily rounds across rooftops to avoid crowded streets, started to share unsettling experiences. What they described were not shadows like those haunting the subway, but something more sinister: figures that seemed to watch them from the edges of their vision. These stories might have remained idle gossip, if not for the frequency with which they surfaced. A painter working on a mural in Brooklyn Heights claimed to hear footsteps behind him as he worked. "I turned around, and there was nothing there," he said, recounting the story to his friends at a nearby bar. "But the paint on my palette, it moved, like someone had dragged their fingers through it." Similarly, rooftop bar patrons in Midtown began reporting strange happenings during late-night drinks. Chairs subtly shifting on their own, glasses tipping over without a gust of wind, and fleeting glimpses of something just beyond the glow of string lights. Local media took notice. A popular blog, Urban Legends NYC, published a story titled "The Rooftop Stalkers: What's Watching the City from Above?" The article compiled dozens of first-hand accounts, paired with blurry photos that only added to the intrigue. One image, taken by a Queens resident, showed an eerie silhouette perched atop a water tower, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. The figure's features were indistinct, but its posture radiated a quiet menace. Skeptics dismissed the image as a hoax or an unusually shaped shadow, yet the comment section exploded with theories. Some tied these rooftop whispers to the subway phenomena, suggesting that whatever lived beneath the city was now expanding its reach. Others believed the two were unrelated, proposing instead that New York's verticality, the sheer number of rooftops, had created an ecosystem of its own. A particularly vocal group insisted that the rooftop stalkers were the spirits of construction workers who had died building the city's skyline, returning to haunt the heights they once labored on. Despite the wild speculation, the whispers reached ears that could not ignore them. Alex Chun, a journalist for a respected digital magazine, decided to investigate. Known for their tenacity, Alex had built a career uncovering urban secrets, from illegal underground clubs to hidden speakeasies. This, however, felt different. Alex approached the story with a mix of skepticism and curiosity, viewing the rooftop sightings as an opportunity to demystify what they assumed were tall tales spun out of urban boredom. Alex's investigation began with interviews. They spoke to rooftop maintenance workers, bartenders, and even pigeon enthusiasts who frequently visited the city's high points. The accounts were eerily consistent. "You'll see something," one bartender said, lowering his voice as if the thing might overhear him. "A shadow, a movement. And when you look, it's gone. But it knows you saw it. And it comes back." Alex pressed for details, but no one could describe the figures clearly. They were always blurry, indistinct, as if they weren't fully there. Determined to find proof, Alex spent several nights hopping rooftops, camera in hand. The first few nights yielded nothing but the usual cityscape: blinking lights, distant horns, the occasional siren. But on the fourth night, as Alex set up a tripod on a Soho rooftop, they noticed a faint sound behind them. It was subtle, like fabric brushing against concrete. Alex turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Only the sensation of being watched lingered, prickling the back of their neck. The breakthrough came the following night. Alex, now joined by a photographer friend, staked out a rooftop in the East Village rumored to be a hotspot for sightings. At 3 a.m., just as fatigue was setting in, the pair spotted movement near a neighboring water tower. The photographer snapped several shots, capturing a tall, humanoid figure crouched low. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its eyes faintly reflective like an animal's in the dark. The moment the flash went off, the figure twisted its head toward them with unnerving speed before vanishing over the roof's edge. When they reviewed the photos later, the images were as unsettling as the encounter itself. The figure's form was distorted, its edges shimmering faintly as though it were partially translucent. But its eyes, cold, calculating, and inhuman, were unmistakably real. Alex published the story alongside the photos, titling the piece, "The Watchers Above. Who or what is watching New York?" The article went viral overnight, reigniting public fears. Rooftops, once seen as refuges from the chaos below, became spaces of dread. Bars closed early, and rooftop gardens fell into disuse. Even the city's pigeons seemed to avoid certain heights. As Alex dug deeper, they began to connect that others had missed. The subway sounds, the rooftop figures, and the increasing number of disappearances. These events weren't isolated. They were symptoms of a larger, darker force spreading across the city. And for the first time, Alex realized they might be in over their head. As New York City grappled with unease from above and below, a new phenomenon began to take hold, one that blurred the line between the rational and the inexplicable. Streetlights, the city's ever-present guardians against the darkness, began to fail in strange and unexplainable patterns. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Streetlights burn out all the time, and no one thought twice when a few went dark in Brooklyn's quieter neighborhoods. But as the outages spread, residents noticed an unsettling trend. The lights weren't failing randomly. They went out in sequences, one after another, as if something was walking beneath them, casting a growing shadow that the city's infrastructure couldn't withstand. The pattern was first observed in Harlem, where a group of teenagers playing basketball at dusk swore they saw the streetlights blink out in a straight line toward their court. It wasn't normal, one of them recounted to a local reporter. They didn't flicker. They just died like something was sucking the power out of them. The boys left the court immediately, but one of them glanced back just in time to see a shape, large, indistinct, and impossibly dark, looming at the edge of the street. Similar accounts began surfacing across the city. Delivery drivers claimed to see entire blocks go dark as they rode through, their headlights doing little to pierce the sudden, oppressive blackness. In Queens, a dog walker reported watching the lights fade one by one behind her as she hurried home. "It was like something was following me," she told her neighbors. "But when I turned around, there was nothing there, just the dark." These reports might have been chalked up to paranoia, if not for the incident on 34th Street. A city bus stalled late one night after its engine inexplicably failed. The driver called for assistance while the passengers grumbled about delays. But as they waited, the streetlights began to fail, starting at the far end of the block and marching steadily toward the immobilized vehicle. Panic spread as the dark approached, swallowing cars and buildings alike. Witnesses claimed to hear a low, guttural hum, like a chorus of whispers just below the range of hearing. By the time help arrived, the bus was empty. The passengers were never found. City officials scrambled for explanations. A spokesperson for Con Edison assured the public that the outages were the result of a localized power surge issue and promised swift repairs. But when reporters pressed for details, the spokesperson faltered, their confidence cracking. Privately, utility workers admitted they were baffled. The city's grid showed no signs of surges or malfunctions. The outages seemed to defy the laws of physics, as though something was extinguishing the lights, not electrically, but fundamentally. Despite the city's reassurances, the phenomenon worsened. The streetlight failures began to occur during the day, plunging sunlit streets into unnatural shadows. These darkened areas carried a suffocating stillness, as if sound itself was afraid to intrude. Pedestrians avoided them instinctively, crossing the street or doubling back to take longer routes. Even the city's notorious traffic seemed to part around these zones, as if drivers were unwilling to risk venturing into the void. Amid this growing fear, a team of urban explorers decided to investigate. Known for documenting abandoned places and underground tunnels, the group, led by a man named Isaac, was no stranger to danger. They live-streamed their exploits, hoping to capture footage of the mysterious darkness. Armed with flashlights and portable generators, they chose a stretch of the Bronx where the outages had been particularly severe. At first, their broadcast was uneventful. The group joked nervously as they navigated the empty streets, their flashlights illuminating little more than cracked pavement and graffiti-covered walls. But as they approached the epicenter of the outages, the air grew heavy and their laughter faded. The streetlights ahead of them began to die, one by one, as though choreographed. "That's not the grid," Isaac muttered, his voice tight with unease. Their flashlights flickered, then dimmed despite fresh batteries. The portable generator sputtered and failed. "This isn't right," one of them whispered, their voice barely audible over the sudden, oppressive silence. The darkness ahead seemed alive, shifting and pulsing like a living thing. The live stream ended abruptly, the screen cutting to static. Isaac's group was never seen again. The footage, recovered days later, sent chills through the city. Just before the stream went dark, the camera caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. A figure tall and impossibly thin, its eyes glowing faintly like embers. It stood motionless, watching the group as they approached, its presence radiating a malice so profound it seemed to warp the space around it. The video confirmed what many feared. The darkness wasn't random. It was deliberate, and whatever was extinguishing the lights wasn't just watching, it was hunting. As panic spread, New Yorkers found themselves paralyzed between two terrors: the unseen threat above and the encroaching darkness below. The city, once so full of light and life, was becoming a place of shadows. Something ancient and malevolent was claiming New York, piece by piece. While the streets darkened and whispers grew louder on the rooftops, a new and equally unsettling phenomenon began to plague New York City. It started subtly, with fleeting moments that could be dismissed as tricks of the light or overworked imaginations. Reflections, long considered harmless and static, began to show signs of rebellion. The first reports came from a high-rise apartment in Chelsea. A woman named Marissa, who worked late nights from home, claimed her reflection didn't move in sync with her one evening. "I was typing on my laptop, but when I glanced at the window, my reflection was staring back at me," she recounted to a friend. "It wasn't typing, it was just watching." Her friend laughed it off as sleep deprivation, but Marissa couldn't shake the experience. Over the next week, she avoided mirrors entirely, covering them with scarves and turning them to the wall. Marissa's story might have remained an oddity if not for the escalation that followed. In a midtown office building, an overnight janitor, Eduardo, had a chilling encounter. He was cleaning the mirrored walls of the lobby when he noticed a smudge that wouldn't wipe away. Frustrated, he leaned closer, only to realize the smudge was a handprint on the inside of the glass. Eduardo fled the building that night, refusing to return even after his supervisor assured him it was a misunderstanding. By the end of the month, these incidents multiplied. Shop owners in Soho began noticing mannequins in their window displays seemed to move, their reflections not aligning with their positions. A barista in Tribeca swore she saw her reflection wave at her when her back was turned. And in a luxury condo on the Upper East Side, a man named Victor woke up to find his bedroom mirror covered in condensation. Written in the fog was a message: "I see you." Unlike the rooftop sightings or the vanishing streetlights, this new anomaly was invasive. It reached into private spaces, bedrooms, bathrooms, elevators, leaving residents with nowhere to feel safe. What made it worse was its unpredictability. While some people experienced nothing, others were haunted daily, as though chosen at random. The city's psychics and spiritualists were quick to capitalize on the fear. Reflections are gateways, proclaimed a self-proclaimed medium on a morning talk show. They've always been portals to the other side. What's happening now is simply the veil thinning. Skeptics dismissed her as a charlatan, but her words struck a chord with those experiencing the phenomenon firsthand. Local artist Jordan Patel became an unlikely spokesperson for the movement to shut down the mirrors. Known for his avant-garde installations, Jordan began a campaign urging businesses and homes to cover or remove reflective surfaces. He posted flyers reading, "A world without mirrors is a world without fear," and even held a protest in Times Square where supporters smashed hand mirrors in compact cases. Critics labeled him a fearmonger, but his message resonated with those desperate for answers. As the city grappled with the growing paranoia, journalist Alex Chun found themselves drawn deeper into the mystery. Having already investigated the rooftop stalkers, Alex was initially skeptical of the reflection rumors. But when they interviewed Victor, the man from the Upper East Side condo, they saw something in his eyes that couldn't be faked: raw terror. "It's not just the mirrors," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the windows. It's the screens. Anything reflective. They're looking at us." Alex decided to test the theory. They covered all the mirrors in their apartment and began an experiment. Sitting in front of their laptop, Alex opened a blank document and angled the screen to catch the reflection of their living room. For hours, nothing happened. But just as they were about to give up, something flickered across the screen. It was faint but unmistakable, a shape moving through the reflection, though the room itself remained empty. The footage Alex captured was chilling. The shape was humanoid, but distorted, as though it were trapped behind the reflective surface. It pressed against the glass of the screen, its face stretching unnaturally as it tried to push through. The image lasted only a second before vanishing, but it was enough to confirm Alex's growing suspicion. The reflections weren't merely showing something different. They were inhabited. Alex's report, titled "Through the Looking Glass: The Danger in Our Reflections," went viral, spreading panic across the city. People began smashing mirrors and covering windows, while tech companies issued statements urging calm, claiming no evidence of anomalies in their devices. But the footage couldn't be ignored. For the first time, the city's fragmented horrors, the shadows, the darkness, and now the reflections, seemed connected. New York City, once a beacon of resilience, was becoming a place of collective paranoia. No one knew where the next threat would emerge, but one thing was clear: whatever was haunting the city wasn't confined to a single domain. It was everywhere, watching, waiting, and growing bolder with each passing day. The mounting fear in New York City reached its first boiling point during a particularly quiet Wednesday night in November, a quiet so unnerving that it seemed to hush even the endless hum of traffic. That night would mark the city's descent into a chaos that no one could deny. The story began in the financial district, where one of the tallest skyscrapers, the iconic Glass Tower, became the epicenter of an event that would paralyze the city. At precisely 9:13 p.m., every window in the building shattered simultaneously, releasing a deafening roar of glass raining down on the streets below. Witnesses described it as if the tower had screamed, its voice reverberating through the concrete canyons. What should have been a tragic but straightforward disaster quickly became something far more sinister. Observers standing blocks away reported seeing shadowy figures in the broken windows of the glass tower, figures that moved as if alive, despite the building being completely evacuated after the explosion of glass. Some claimed the shadows waved, while others swore they saw them leap from the windows, only to dissolve into the air before hitting the ground. The city scrambled to contain the fallout. Emergency services cordoned off the area, but their efforts were met with resistance from terrified residents. Dozens of people tried to flee the financial district, shouting about things in the shadows chasing them. Paramedics treated victims not for injuries from falling glass, but for seizures and panic attacks. Many of these individuals claimed to hear voices whispering directly into their minds. Alex Chun, who had been nearby conducting interviews for their next article, rushed to the scene. The reporter described the aftermath as a war zone painted in glass and fear. But what struck Alex most wasn't the physical destruction. It was the silence that followed. Once the dust settled, the financial district seemed to fall into an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant wail of sirens. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, Alex wrote later. In the days following the event, investigators could find no logical explanation for the mass shattering. Structural engineers ruled out vibration or stress fractures, and there were no signs of explosives. Security footage from within the glass tower only deepened the mystery. At the exact moment the windows broke, every camera glitched, displaying static for 13 seconds. When the footage resumed, it captured only the aftermath, swaying curtains, empty offices, and the faint echoes of something unplaceable, like distant chanting. As Alex dug deeper, they uncovered unsettling testimonies from the tower's employees. Many had experienced inexplicable events in the weeks leading up to the incident. Some heard footsteps behind them in empty hallways, while others reported seeing reflections in the glass that didn't match their movements. One night security guard even quit after claiming to see his own reflection blink at him when his eyes were closed. The city's government, now visibly strained under the pressure of these growing anomalies, issued vague reassurances. Mayor Gleason called the incident a freak accident and urged citizens to remain calm. But the mayor's unconvincing tone and the hurried way he left the press conference only fueled conspiracy theories. Online forums lit up with speculation, ranging from secret experiments gone wrong to ancient curses tied to the city's colonial past. One detail, however, began to unite the various theories. The Glass Tower event wasn't an isolated occurrence. Reports started pouring in from other skyscrapers across Manhattan. Cleaners, office workers, and night security staff shared stories of strange reflections in windows, whispers emanating from walls, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. These reports suggested that whatever had happened at the Glass Tower wasn't contained. It was spreading. For Alex, the connection between the shattered silence of the tower and the city's other mysteries became undeniable. They began piecing together a chilling pattern. The rooftop watchers, the vanishing streetlights, the rebellious reflections, and now this. Each event seemed to mark a new level of incursion, as though the city's reality was being rewritten by something hostile. As the chapter of the Glass Tower's destruction closed, a chilling realization dawned on the city. This wasn't just a series of unrelated hauntings or paranormal events. It was a coordinated invasion. And for the first time, New Yorkers began to understand the scale of what they were facing. Whatever this was, it wasn't just hunting individuals, it was consuming the city itself. New York City's reputation for resilience had always been its defining trait. It had endured natural disasters, terror attacks, and countless smaller crises, emerging each time with a renewed sense of defiance. But this invasion of the unreal, was breaking the city's spirit in ways no one could have predicted. By now, everyone from Harlem to Battery Park felt it, a creeping sense of siege, as though the city was no longer governed by the natural laws of the world. The first sign of escalation came in the subway system, the lifeblood of New York. For decades, the underground tunnels had been a source of urban legend. Stories of mole people, phantom trains, and unidentifiable noises echoing in the dark. But those old tales now seemed quaint compared to the horrors commuters began reporting. It started on the N train heading downtown. Midway between Canal Street and Prince Street, the train jerked to a sudden halt, plunging the car into darkness. Passengers groaned, accustomed to the delays of the aging transit system. But when the emergency lights flickered on, the collective groan turned into a scream. Every window in the train had gone black. Not dark like the tunnels outside, but an impenetrable void, as though the windows no longer existed. From this void came whispers, dozens of overlapping voices speaking in a language no one could understand. The sound grew louder, until it was deafening, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The lights came back on, and the train began to move again. But the passengers, pale and trembling, would never forget what they'd heard. Over the next week, similar incidents occurred across the subway network. Entire trains vanished from their schedules. only to reappear hours later with no passengers aboard. Station workers at Times Square claimed they saw shadowy figures pacing the platforms after the last trains had left for the night. In Queens, a woman fainted after witnessing a reflection in the subway window that wasn't hers. Above ground, the city's chaos intensified. Reports of strange occurrences poured in from every borough. In a Lower East Side bakery, customers watched in horror as a dozen loaves of bread spontaneously burst into flame. In Central Park, joggers found themselves unable to leave the paths, running in circles for hours despite their best efforts to escape. City officials struggled to maintain order. The mayor's office launched a hotline for citizens to report anomalies, but the sheer volume of calls overwhelmed the system within days. Police officers refused to patrol certain neighborhoods after nightfall, citing an unexplained increase in officer injuries. Firefighters responding to an emergency in a Bronx high-rise found themselves trapped in a stairwell that spiraled endlessly upward, taking hours to escape. Journalist Alex Chun, determined to uncover the truth, delved into the city's history for answers. They uncovered records of similar events dating back centuries. A 1783 letter from a fur trader described phantoms in the river that lured boats into the fog. A police report from 1921 detailed an entire block in Hell's Kitchen that reportedly vanished for 3 hours, reappearing with no explanation. But Alex's most chilling discovery came from a retired urban planner named Eleanor Weiss. In the 1970s, Weiss had overseen a project to map Manhattan's oldest structures. During her research, she had come across strange anomalies, unmarked basements that extended far deeper than they should, sealed-off rooms behind brick walls, and tunnels that didn't match any known blueprints. Weiss described her findings as evidence of a city within the city, one we weren't meant to uncover. Armed with this knowledge, Alex began to piece together a theory. The strange events weren't random. They were concentrated around specific locations: subway junctions, old churches, abandoned warehouses. These places formed a pattern, one that, when mapped, resembled an ancient sigil. The implications were terrifying. If this sigil was some kind of marker, what had it been meant to contain? And more importantly, what had now been unleashed? The city itself seemed to react to Alex's discovery. That night, as they reviewed their notes in their small Chinatown apartment, the lights flickered ominously. The shadows in the room lengthened unnaturally, pooling in the corners like liquid. Alex's laptop screen glitched, and for a moment, they saw a figure staring back at them. A figure with hollow eyes and a mouth that didn't move but somehow spoke. "You're close," the voice hissed, though Alex heard it in their mind rather than their ears. "But you can't stop it." The screen went black, and the room returned to normal. Alex sat frozen, their heart pounding, but their resolve unbroken. Whatever was happening to New York, it was accelerating, and Alex knew they had to act fast. For the first time in their career, Alex considered that exposing the truth might not save the city, it might destroy it. But as the whispers in the shadows grew louder, one thing became certain. The city was no longer in control of its own fate. Something ancient and malevolent had taken hold, and it was only just beginning. The growing unease in New York City had become inescapable, threading through the lives of its citizens like a poison vine. Each passing day brought new tales of inexplicable events, as though the city's fabric were unraveling to reveal something dark and ancient beneath. But amidst the chaos, there was one place that stood out as the nucleus of the dread: the financial district, where the glass tower still loomed like a silent sentinel over the city. For Alex Chun, the tower's destruction had been the spark for their investigation, but it was now clear that the building's significance ran far deeper. Determined to dig further, Alex contacted Eleanor Weiss, the retired urban planner whose research had uncovered Manhattan's hidden anomalies. Weiss was initially reluctant to meet again, claiming she had said all she needed to say. But after persistent prodding, Alex convinced her to join them for a late-night expedition to the ruins of the glass tower. The streets leading to the building were eerily empty. Police barricades blocked off most access points, but there were no officers stationed nearby. It was as if the authorities had abandoned their posts, leaving the district to its own devices. As Alex and Weiss approached the building, they were struck by the strange stillness. The air felt heavier, as though some invisible force pressed down on them, and even the sound of their footsteps seemed muffled. Once they reached the shattered base of the tower, Weiss hesitated, visibly shaken. She pointed to the jagged remnants of glass scattered across the ground. "Do you see it?" she asked, her voice trembling. At first, Alex saw nothing unusual, but as they looked closer, they noticed something unnerving. The shards of glass reflected not the surrounding streetlights or the faint glow of the moon, but a flickering, otherworldly darkness. "It's like they're holding onto the shadows," Alex whispered. Weiss nodded grimly. "This isn't just glass anymore. It's been altered." As they stepped closer to the building's entrance, Alex spotted a gaping hole in the foundation where the lobby used to be. The jagged edges of the floor seemed to slope downward into a cavernous darkness that hadn't been there before the building's collapse. A faint hum emanated from the abyss, a sound that resonated in their bones rather than their ears. "We shouldn't go down there," Weiss said, her voice barely audible. "Whatever's beneath this building isn't meant to be disturbed." But Alex was undeterred. Armed with a flashlight and their recording equipment, they began descending into the pit, with Weiss reluctantly following. The walls of the cavern were lined with strange, pulsating veins of a substance that glowed faintly in the dark. It reminded Alex of roots, but they were warm to the touch and seemed to recoil slightly at their presence. As they ventured deeper, the hum grew louder, and the air became stifling. The tunnel eventually opened into a massive chamber, the size of a football field. In the center stood a monolithic structure, a black obelisk that seemed to absorb all light. Strange symbols covered its surface, shifting and rearranging themselves as Alex tried to read them. Weiss gasped, clutching Alex's arm. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what I saw in the maps. The sigil. The core." Before Alex could respond, the hum shifted into a deep, resonant tone that filled the chamber. The symbols on the obelisk began to glow, and the cavern itself seemed to come alive. Shadows coalesced around them, forming indistinct figures that flickered between solid and vaporous states. These entities moved closer, their presence oppressive and suffocating. "We need to leave," Weiss said urgently, her voice barely rising above the sound. But Alex couldn't move, transfixed by the obelisk and the faint whispers that now emanated from it. The whispers grew louder, forming words in a language that Alex couldn't understand, but somehow felt they could comprehend. It was as though the obelisk was speaking directly to their mind, showing them flashes of a different time, a time when the city was not yet built, and the land belonged to something older, something hungry. Suddenly, one of the shadow figures lunged toward them. Weiss screamed, pulling Alex back just in time. The spell was broken, and Alex's instincts kicked in. They scrambled toward the tunnel entrance, with Weiss close behind. The shadows pursued them, their movements erratic but relentless. As they reached the surface, the first rays of dawn began to break over the city. The shadows halted, recoiling from the light like smoke dissipating in the wind. Alex and Weiss collapsed on the pavement, gasping for air. "We can't fight this," Weiss said, her face pale and drawn. "Whatever this is, it's beyond us." But Alex shook their head, determination hardening their features. "No," they said, "this is our city, and if we don't stop it, no one will." Unbeknownst to them, the obelisk deep beneath the glass tower pulsed one final time, sending a ripple through the earth. Above ground, the city trembled ever so slightly, as though waking from a restless sleep. The siege wasn't just continuing, it was evolving. The days following Alex and Eleanor Weiss's harrowing escape from the glass tower's ruins were marked by a strange tension that gripped New York City like a tightening noose. Residents awoke to find that the anomalies were no longer confined to isolated events. Entire neighborhoods reported simultaneous disturbances. Buildings groaned as though alive, streetlights flickered in cryptic patterns, and shadows seemed to stretch and crawl with malevolent intent. It wasn't just the city that was alive. It was as if the city was thinking. Alex retreated to their Chinatown apartment, sifting through the evidence they had gathered. Their notes, photographs, and recordings all pointed to one undeniable truth. The glass tower's destruction had awakened something ancient and powerful. But the real question wasn't what had been unleashed. It was why. Why now? Weiss, still shaken from their encounter, reluctantly agreed to help Alex dig deeper. The obelisk wasn't just a monument, she said during a late-night phone call. It was a containment device. Whatever we saw down there wasn't meant to be freed. Weiss's tone was laced with guilt, as though she carried the weight of a centuries-old secret. As Alex pieced together the fragments of their investigation, a chilling pattern emerged. The obelisk sigils matched carvings found in old church basements and subway murals scattered across the city. Each symbol seemed to represent a node, a point of power in an invisible network that stretched beneath New York. This wasn't a random series of events. It was a ritual, one that had been brewing for centuries. Alex knew they needed more answers, and Weiss suggested a source, an obscure historian named Dr. Gabriel Hartman. Hartman had spent decades researching the occult history of New York, uncovering connections between urban legends, architecture, and ancient rituals. If anyone knows what's happening, it's him, Weiss said. Hartman lived in a crumbling brownstone in Washington Heights, his home a chaotic library of dusty tomes and yellowed maps. When Alex and Weiss arrived, Hartman greeted them with wary curiosity. "You're not the first to come looking for answers," he said, ushering them inside. "But you might be the first to survive long enough to use them." Hartman explained that New York's foundation wasn't merely physical, it was spiritual. Long before the Dutch arrived, the land had been a place of power, a convergence of ley lines that made it a beacon for energy, both good and evil. Indigenous peoples had respected and safeguarded this energy, but as the city grew, the balance was disrupted. The construction of towering skyscrapers, sprawling tunnels, and endless grids had acted as a kind of ritual in itself, carving into the Earth's veins and amplifying its latent power. The glass tower wasn't just any building, Hartman said, his voice grave. It was the keystone. Its destruction wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, wanted to break the seal. Alex felt a chill run down their spine. But why now? What's the endgame? Hartman hesitated, then pulled out an ancient map of Manhattan overlaid with symbols and notations. The pattern we're seeing aligns with a celestial event, a convergence that happens once every 500 years. The last time this occurred, the city didn't exist. Now, it's a perfect vessel for whatever is coming through. Weiss's face turned pale as she stared at the map. So, the city itself is a ritual site? And with a sacrifice? Hartman nodded grimly. In a sense, yes. But there's still a chance to disrupt it. The nodes, the points of power, must be neutralized. If even one remains active, the ritual will complete itself. Armed with this revelation, Alex and Weiss left Hartman's home with a renewed sense of urgency. They mapped out the nodes, marking locations across the boroughs: an abandoned church in Brooklyn, a derelict theater in Harlem, a crumbling lighthouse on Staten Island, and others. Each site pulsed with the same energy they had felt at the glass tower. But the journey would not be simple. That night, as Alex reviewed their plan, the city itself seemed to rebel against them. Their apartment shook violently, cracks spreading across the walls. The lights flickered, and the air grew thick with the smell of ozone. From the corner of their eye, Alex saw a shadow move. Not cast by any object, but a shadow that existed independently, creeping toward them. The whispers began again, louder this time, and more coherent. "You're too late," they hissed, overlapping voices blending into a sinister chorus. "It's already begun." Alex bolted upright, heart racing. Grabbing their equipment, they fled into the night, leaving the apartment to whatever malevolent force had claimed it. As they stepped into the street, they saw the city's lights dimming in waves, plunging block after block into darkness. Above, the sky swirled with unnatural clouds, glowing faintly with a reddish hue. The city was no longer just the setting of their story. It had become the enemy, and time was running out to stop its transformation. But even as Alex steeled themselves for the battle ahead, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much darker truth. Something ancient had awakened, and its hunger was boundless. New York City felt like it was holding its breath, the weight of unseen forces pressing down on every corner. Each passing hour brought new reports of inexplicable phenomena. Subway trains halting mid-tunnel without power, flocks of birds flying in unnatural formations above the skyline, and people vanishing in broad daylight. The city was unrecognizable, no longer a hive of restless energy, but a battleground for something far older than its skyscrapers. Alex and Eleanor Weiss drove toward the first node on their map, an abandoned church in Brooklyn's Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood. The church had been decommissioned decades ago, its once proud spire now cracked and leaning. Despite its derelict state, it had a reputation among locals as a place to avoid. Whispers of strange lights and chanting had long made it an urban legend, but now Alex suspected it was something far worse. The drive was eerie. The streets were nearly empty, an unsettling quiet blanketing the normally vibrant borough. As they approached the church, Alex noticed the air seemed thicker, each breath carrying a metallic tang. The building loomed ahead, its Gothic arches casting jagged shadows under the dim streetlights. Eleanor hesitated as they stepped out of the car. "Are we even sure this will work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Alex admitted, "but we have to try. If Hartman's right, neutralizing the node will disrupt the energy flow. We need to start somewhere." Inside, the church was worse than they imagined. The pews were overturned, and the floor was strewn with decaying hymnals and debris. At the far end, where the altar once stood, was a gaping hole, its edges lined with the same pulsating veins Alex had seen beneath the glass tower. A faint glow emanated from the hole, accompanied by a low, rhythmic hum that set their teeth on edge. The air felt electric, charged with an energy that made their skin prickle. Alex set up their equipment, a handheld scanner modified to detect electromagnetic anomalies, and aimed it toward the hole. The device immediately spiked, its screen flashing red. "This is it," Alex said, gripping the scanner tightly. Weiss stepped forward cautiously, her flashlight revealing something carved into the floor around the hole, a circular pattern of sigils, identical to those on the obelisk beneath the glass tower. The symbols glowed faintly, as if alive, their light pulsing in time with the hum. "We need to destroy the circle," Weiss said. "It's anchoring the node." Alex pulled a crowbar from their bag, the metal cold and reassuring in their grip. But as they approached the circle, the air seemed to ripple, and the temperature dropped suddenly. Shadows began to gather in the corners of the church, coalescing into shapes that moved with an unnerving fluidity. One of the shadows lunged toward Alex, a formless mass of darkness that radiated malice. Alex swung the crowbar instinctively, but the weapon passed through the shadow without resistance. The entity recoiled briefly before surging forward again, its movements more aggressive. Weiss grabbed Alex, pulling them back toward the center of the room. "We need to break the sigils. Focus on the circle," she shouted. With trembling hands, Alex knelt and began chipping away at the glowing symbols. Each strike of the crowbar sent sparks flying, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening. The shadows grew more frenzied, swirling around them like a storm. One shadow darted toward Weiss, who screamed as it grazed her arm. The contact left a dark, frostbitten mark that spread across her skin like ink. "Hurry," she cried, clutching her arm in pain. Finally, Alex struck a critical point in the circle. The sigils flickered violently before fading entirely, their glow extinguished. The hum ceased abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural groan that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The shadows froze, their forms wavering, before dissolving into wisps of smoke. For a moment, there was silence. Alex and Weiss collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Did it work?" Weiss asked, her voice hoarse. Alex checked the scanner, which now showed only faint traces of energy. "I think so," they said. But even as they spoke, they couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was fleeting. This was only one node, and the city still pulsed with an ancient, insidious life. As they stumbled back to their car, the church behind them groaned, its structure sagging as though relieved of an unbearable burden. Alex glanced back at the crumbling building and thought of the other nodes scattered across the city. The fight had only just begun, and the enemy was everywhere. The aftermath of the battle at the church left Alex and Eleanor with a sense of hollow victory. Though the first node had been neutralized, the lingering sense of dread told them that the war had only just begun. The city, it seemed, was still pulsing with a dark energy, an energy that, despite their best efforts, had not been fully disrupted. As they sat in the cramped car, their eyes met across the dashboard, both of them grappling with the weight of what had happened, but neither wanting to voice the fear that clawed at them. The next node, according to their map, was buried beneath the city itself, the tunnels of the old subway system. These tunnels were not part of the modern transit system, but older, forgotten lines abandoned decades ago. It was a place where rumors flourished, stories of ghostly figures and strange occurrences drifting through the decaying tracks. Yet, these stories, Alex suspected, were far more than just local folklore. They were the echoes of a time when the city's underground was a conduit for something far darker. The tunnels were deep, and the layers of New York's history pressed down on them like the weight of the earth itself. For centuries, people had built, expanded, and then abandoned parts of the city, leaving behind hidden spaces full of secrets. The subway, which had once been a symbol of New York's relentless growth, now housed a dormant evil. Alex and Weiss stood at the entrance of a long-forgotten subway station, the air thick with dampness. The distant sound of dripping water was the only noise that greeted them, and the overwhelming silence was almost oppressive. There was no sign of the creature they had faced in the church, but Alex could feel its presence lingering, an invisible force tugging at the edges of their mind. "We have no idea what we're walking into," Weiss said, breaking the silence. Her voice echoed strangely in the hollow space around them. "I know," Alex replied, "but the sooner we shut down this node, the sooner we can find out if we're on the right track." With each step they took into the darkness, the sense of unease grew. The beams of their flashlights sliced through the gloom, illuminating decaying walls covered in graffiti and peeling advertisements from a bygone era. The deeper they went, the more the temperature seemed to drop, until their breath began to condense in the air, fogging up their vision. At the end of the tunnel, the walls opened up into a vast chamber. It was eerily quiet, save for the occasional scraping sound that echoed off the stone. The floor of the chamber was covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the concrete. These symbols, too, resembled the ones Alex had seen near the glass tower and in the church. Weiss knelt beside one of the symbols, tracing her fingers along its jagged edges. "This one is different," she muttered. "This one looks more recent." Alex looked around, the hairs on the back of their neck prickling. Something about the place felt off, more so than the church had. It was as though the very air was waiting for something. The sense of unease they had felt throughout their journey suddenly became overwhelming, a pressure in their chest that made it hard to breathe. Without warning, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A low, guttural sound rumbled from deep within the chamber, and the walls began to crack, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. "It's waking up," Alex said urgently, backing toward the entrance. "We need to move now." But it was too late. From the cracks in the walls emerged tendrils of blackness, thin at first, then thickening into coils that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. The air became thick with the stench of decay, and the darkness seemed to grow, reaching out toward them like an unseen hand. Alex could feel the power emanating from the node, as if it were alive and aware of their presence. Weiss shouted for Alex to move, but before either of them could react, the tendrils shot out, grabbing hold of the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling. The chamber began to shift and warp, the very structure of the space distorting as if the node itself were reshaping reality. Time seemed to stretch, bending in unnatural ways. One moment, the room was solid, and the next, the floor beneath their feet dissolved into darkness, dropping them into an abyss. Alex's heart pounded in their chest, but there was no time to panic. As the floor crumbled, They reached out, grabbing Weiss's hand just before they were swallowed by the shifting void. For a moment, everything went black. Then, with a jolt, Alex felt solid ground beneath them. They had fallen, but they were not alone. The chamber was still there, but now it was warped, twisted beyond recognition. The symbols on the walls had begun to pulse with a sinister red light, and the tendrils of darkness continued to writhe around them. "Where are we?" Weiss whispered, her voice trembling. Alex scanned the room, their eyes adjusting to the new reality. The air was thick with a choking fog, and the walls were now lined with grotesque, writhing figures. Half-formed shapes that seemed to be trapped within the walls themselves, their faces contorted in silent screams. "This isn't the subway anymore," Alex said, their voice hollow with realization. "This place, it's another layer of the city. A place between worlds." Before them, a shadow began to take shape, tall, impossibly thin, its features barely discernible in the dim light. It was watching them. Alex knew one thing for certain. They weren't just battling a force of nature anymore. They were facing something sentient, something that had been lying dormant beneath the city for centuries, and it was awake. The shadows seemed to breathe around them, an invisible force pressing in on Alex and Weiss as they stood in the midst of the twisted, corrupted chamber. The figure before them, a tall, emaciated silhouette, flickered in and out of focus, as though it were both part of the room and separate from it. Its features were unnervingly indistinct, like the smudged silhouette of a person viewed from the edge of a dream, but its presence was undeniable. It watched them, its gaze cutting through the fog, penetrating to places Alex wasn't sure they wanted to be seen. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the thumping of their own hearts, loud and frantic in the stillness. The air was thick with tension. Each breath they took feeling heavier than the last. Alex's mind raced, processing what they had seen, the tendrils, the shifting space, the grotesque figures trapped in the walls. This was no longer a place of forgotten subway lines. It was a manifestation of something far older, a liminal space between worlds, a place that shouldn't exist. But even in the face of the unknown, there was no turning back. The task at hand was still the same: neutralize the node. The realization weighed heavily on Alex, knowing that the stakes had escalated far beyond anything they had prepared for. They weren't just uncovering forgotten aspects of the city. They were staring into the abyss, and the abyss was staring back. Weiss, ever the pragmatist, moved first. She stepped forward cautiously, eyes fixed on the figure that seemed to shift with every glance. "We need to find out what it wants," she whispered, though Alex could hear the tremor in her voice. It was clear she was just as shaken as they were, but her resolve remained intact. Alex nodded, though every instinct screamed to turn and flee. "Let's just be careful." They advanced, each step slow and deliberate, as if any sudden movement might provoke the shadow into action. As they drew nearer, the figure's features began to solidify, though it remained unsettlingly vague. A pair of hollow eyes glowed faintly from within its skull-like face, reflecting an intelligence that sent a cold chill down Alex's spine. It wasn't just a watcher. It was waiting, studying them, as if it had known they would come long before they had ever set foot in the subway tunnels. Alex's mind was swirling, trying to make sense of the impossible. Was this a manifestation of the node? A being created from the very essence of the darkness they had disturbed? Or was it something else entirely? Something older? Maybe even older than the city itself? The air around them seemed to shimmer with unnatural energy, and Alex could almost feel the ground beneath their feet pulse in time with their racing heartbeat. For a moment, the figure did nothing. It merely stood, watching, its presence suffocating. Alex felt a strange sensation in their chest, an unbearable weight of realization. They were not the only ones in this place. It wasn't just the node they had to face. There was something else here, something that had been watching the city for far longer than they could comprehend. "We need to move," Alex said, breaking the silence. The words felt strange, hollow in the oppressive atmosphere, but they could sense the urgency now. This watcher, this being, they didn't need to understand it fully to know it was dangerous. And the longer they stayed in its presence, the more it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Without warning, the figure shifted. It didn't move in the conventional sense. It seemed to bend space itself, its limbs elongating unnaturally, like a mirage caught in the wrong dimension. It towered above them now, impossibly tall, its form flickering like a malfunctioning television screen. Alex felt the temperature drop suddenly, an icy blast that seemed to freeze their very thoughts. "Do you feel that?" Weiss whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex nodded, though they weren't sure if they were ready to admit how deep the terror ran. It was more than just fear. It was a sense of powerlessness, a realization that they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. In the face of the shadow's gaze, all the bravado they had built over the course of their journey evaporated. The Watcher's hollow eyes flickered, and then, in an instant, the room seemed to bend around them. Alex felt a sudden vertigo as the walls twisted, the air thickening as if the very space they stood in was folding in on itself. A deep, resonating hum filled their ears, and before they could react, the floor beneath them cracked open, spilling them into another layer of darkness. Falling, tumbling into the abyss of shadow, Alex tried to reach out for Weiss but couldn't grasp anything. The world was a blur of chaotic movement, distorted shapes, and sounds warping with every passing second. It felt like they were being pulled through the very fabric of reality itself. Just as Alex thought they were about to lose all sense of self, the sensation stopped. The fall ceased, and they landed with a sickening thud onto something soft. For a moment, everything was quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had gripped them was gone, replaced with a strange sense of calm. But even as the stillness settled in, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. They pushed themselves up, their vision still blurry from the disorienting fall. Looking around, they realized with horror that they were no longer in the twisted chamber of shifting walls. Instead, they were in a vast, desolate expanse, a landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. The ground beneath them was cracked and dry, and the sky above was a murky gray, with no sun in sight. And then in the distance they saw it. A silhouette. No, another Watcher. And beyond that more. The sky, the land, it was full of them. The Watchers had not just been confined to the tunnel. They were everywhere. Alex's heart sank. What had they awakened? And more importantly, how much time did they have before the Watchers realized they were no longer in control? The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint sound of whispers in the wind, and Alex knew one thing for certain. Their battle had only just begun. The bleak landscape before Alex and Weiss was disorienting, a twisted panorama that stretched into nothingness. The ground beneath their feet felt foreign, like they were standing on the skin of something alive, something aware. The air was thick with a strange, almost suffocating energy. The Watchers, shadowy figures that had surrounded them moments ago, were now more numerous, scattered throughout the expanse. They stood motionless, their empty gazes fixed on Alex and Weiss, as though waiting for something to unfold. What that something was, however, remained uncertain. It was as if the very ground they stood on had no beginning or end. Every direction seemed to lead into more of the same. Cracked earth, twisted shapes, and the looming presence of those ever-watchful figures. There was no horizon to guide them, no landmarks to provide a sense of scale or direction. The world was an endless loop, one that refused to resolve itself, a place where time seemed to stretch and warp. Alex wondered if they were even still on Earth. The sky overhead felt like a warped mirror, stretching and distorting in ways that made the very concept of reality seem malleable. "What now?" Weiss asked, her voice tight with anxiety. She glanced around them, her eyes flickering between the Watchers. There was no obvious way forward, no exit to the expanse they were trapped in. It was as if they had fallen into a new realm, one that existed outside of time and space. A place where the laws of nature had ceased to matter. "We move forward," Alex replied, though they weren't entirely convinced by their own words. The weight of uncertainty pressed in on them, making each step forward feel like a leap into the unknown. But there was no other choice. Standing still would do nothing, but invite the watchers closer. The figure that had led them here, the one they had seen flicker in and out of existence, had somehow orchestrated this, and they had to understand why. Alex's eyes scanned the horizon, looking for anything that might provide a clue. A break in the landscape, a shift in the pattern of watchers, anything that could lead them out of this maze. But all they saw was the endless stretch of the same empty space. The farther they walked, the more they felt like they were moving in circles, like they were caught in an eternal loop with no escape. Then, as if to punctuate their growing dread, a low hum began to vibrate through the ground. The sound was barely perceptible at first, but it grew louder and more insistent, reverberating in Alex's chest. The hum seemed to come from all directions at once, an unnatural pulse that rattled their bones. Weiss tensed beside them, her hand instinctively gripping the edge of their jacket. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice low and unnerved. Alex nodded, a sinking feeling growing in their stomach. "It's like it's everywhere." The sensation was almost physical, as though the sound was warping the very air they breathed, the walls of their perception pressing in tighter with each passing second. And then, without warning, the watchers moved. At first, it was a single figure that stepped forward, its limbs contorting in unnatural ways. Its face remained a blurry mass, but the hollow eyes, those eyes that had watched them from the moment they arrived, seemed to pierce through Alex. Another watcher stepped forward, then another, until the entire expanse was filled with them, moving in unison, slowly closing in on Alex and Weiss. The movement was slow, methodical, like a tide creeping forward. Yet, despite the surreal and eerie quality of their advance, Alex felt a deep sense of urgency. They were no longer being watched from afar. The watchers were drawing closer, and the closer they got, the more tangible the threat felt. They had been aware of their presence since the moment they arrived, but now it was as if the watchers were gathering for something, as if they were preparing to act. "We need to get out of here," Weiss hissed, her voice shaking now. She tugged at Alex's arm, trying to lead them in what she hoped was a direction away from the approaching figures. But every time they moved, it felt like the landscape shifted beneath them, as though it was alive and was pushing them back toward the center of the maze. The watchers had not only surrounded them, they had trapped them in this twisted reality, a cage of shifting dimensions. "Wait," Alex said, stopping abruptly. They could feel the pull of something unseen, an unseen force drawing them toward the center of the expanse. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Whatever had created this place had engineered their every movement, it seemed. Weiss stopped as well, glancing at Alex in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "We need to keep moving." But Alex wasn't sure. They felt it, that strange pull. It was like a thread pulling them toward the center, toward the watchers, toward the source of this nightmare. They didn't know how, but they had a sudden sense that the key to escaping this maze was right there, in the very heart of it. "We can't keep running," Alex said, their voice firmer now. "We need to go toward the center. That's where the answer is." "Are you insane?" Weiss shot back. "That's where they are." "I know," Alex replied, their gaze fixed on the swirling mass of shadowy figures slowly approaching. "But we have to confront it. We can't keep running forever. If we don't figure out what's at the heart of this, we'll never get out." With reluctance, Weiss nodded, though Alex could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't want to confront whatever it was that had drawn them here, but deep down, she understood that Alex was right. The watchers weren't just passive observers anymore. They were closing in, preparing for something. Every step they took to avoid the center seemed to lead them deeper into the maze. There was no escaping this place unless they figured out how to end it. So, with a deep breath and an uncertain heart, Alex began to walk toward the center, leading Weiss into the unknown. Each step felt heavier than the last, the hum beneath them growing louder and more insistent, until it was a full-blown roar in their ears. The watchers had not moved, but their eyes followed every movement with terrifying precision. And then, just as they neared the epicenter, something strange happened. The ground beneath them began to pulse, like a heartbeat, slow at first, but gaining momentum with every passing second. The sky above began to twist, the gray mist bleeding into darker shades of red and black. The watchers remained frozen in place, but Alex could feel something shifting, something about to break. They had entered the center, and the real nightmare was about to begin. The moment Alex and Weiss crossed into the center, everything changed. The pulse of the ground beneath their feet became a rhythmic, almost mechanical thrum, a sound that seemed to reverberate not just in their bones, but in the air itself. It was as though the entire expanse of this strange dimension was alive, breathing, watching, and waiting. The watchers, who had silently encircled them, remained motionless, but somehow more present, their unblinking eyes fixed upon the pair with an intensity that made the air feel suffocating. At the center, there was no obvious structure or landmark to guide them, only an overwhelming sense of depth and weight. It was as if they were standing on the edge of some infinite abyss, an endless chasm that pulled at their very being. There were no visible walls, no barriers. It was as though they were floating in a void where the rules of space and time had ceased to exist. The space around them seemed to fold and ripple, constantly shifting as though it were a fluid organic thing. For a moment, Alex felt as if they might fall into the abyss, that the very ground they stood on could vanish at any second, taking them with it. "Do you feel that?" Weiss asked in a strained voice, her eyes wide as she scanned the empty space around them. Her hand reached out instinctively, grabbing Alex's sleeve as if to steady herself. Alex nodded slowly, trying to steady their own nerves. The pull was stronger now, the sensation that they were no longer merely participants in this maze, but rather at the epicenter of whatever force controlled this dimension. Every step they took seemed to intensify the sensation that they were being drawn deeper into the unknown. The watchers were silent, but Alex could sense their anticipation, as if they too were waiting for something to unfold. Without warning, the air in front of them shimmered, like a mirage or a distortion in the fabric of reality itself. The space itself seemed to stretch, and a figure materialized within it. At first, it was barely discernible, a blur of shadow and light. But then, slowly, it came into focus, and Alex's heart skipped a beat. It was the same figure they had seen before, the one who had flickered in and out of existence, the one who had led them into this nightmare. But this time, the figure was no longer shifting or phasing. It stood solidly before them, its form clearer than ever. Its face, however, remained an indistinct blur, as though it was simultaneously there and not there, a presence rather than a person. "You've made it this far," the figure said, its voice a low hum, like the echo of 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "But do you understand why you're here?" Alex's mouth felt dry, and they glanced at Weiss, whose face was etched with confusion and fear. The answer to the figure's question seemed elusive, something they couldn't quite grasp, but knew was crucial. They had followed the thread of their own doubts and fears, come to terms with the reality that there were no clear answers, only further questions. Yet they couldn't shake the feeling that this was the pivotal moment, the one where everything would change. "We're here because we followed you," Alex said cautiously, trying to keep their voice steady despite the overwhelming pressure that seemed to build around them. "But I don't understand. Who are you? What is this place? Why are we here?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if amused by the simplicity of the question. "Do you think you're the first to ask those questions?" It responded. "This place is not a place. It is a crossroads, a decision point." The figure's voice grew softer, almost contemplative. "Every soul that comes here must make a choice. It is not about what you see, but what you choose to believe. And what you choose will determine whether you leave or remain." The words hung in the air, laden with a heavy significance that Alex could feel pressing against them, urging them to understand something deeper, something fundamental. They had been led here, they knew that much. But why? And what did this choice mean? What was the decision that the figure spoke of? Was it a choice of escape or an acceptance of fate? Was there a difference between the two? Choice. Weiss repeated, her voice shaky. "What do you mean? What happens if we choose wrong?" The figure remained silent for a long moment, its form flickering as if momentarily uncertain, or perhaps toying with them. Finally, it spoke again, its voice softer this time, almost sympathetic. It is not about right or wrong. It is about understanding the truth of what you are. You cannot leave until you do. Alex felt a cold shiver run through them, and for the first time, the sense of dread they had been suppressing took root in their chest. They could feel it, the weight of an invisible force pressing in on them from all sides. This was not just some test, some external puzzle to be solved. It was a question of their very essence, of who they were and why they had come this far. "Why us?" Alex asked, their voice barely a whisper. "Why have you chosen us?" The figure remained silent for a moment, and then it spoke again, its tone now tinged with something darker. "You were not chosen," it said cryptically. "You chose yourselves. You were always meant to be here, even if you did not know it. The maze is not just a place, Alex. It is a reflection of your own choices, your own fears, your own desires. And the deeper you go, the more you understand yourself." The words hit Alex like a wave, and for a brief moment, they could feel the weight of every decision, every misstep, every moment of doubt in their life pressing down on them. The maze was not just a physical location. It was a mirror, reflecting their innermost fears, regrets, and desires. And now, they were at the heart of it, at the point where everything would either break or resolve. Weiss looked at Alex, her expression one of disbelief. This is a test? A test of who we are?" The figure gave no answer, only gestured toward the distance. "The choice is yours. Will you face it, or will you turn away?" The space around them seemed to shift once more, and the watchers, who had remained passive observers until now, began to move. Their eyes glowed faintly, and the sound of their collective breathing filled the air, a subtle reminder of the vast presence surrounding them. Alex could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on them, the pull of this place stronger than ever. The figure had made it clear that there was no easy answer, no clear way out. The choice was not just about escaping this nightmare. It was about understanding their place within it. As the maze stretched on around them, Alex and Weiss had no choice but to step forward. The next part of their journey, the true test, had begun. In the wake of the figure's cryptic words, the maze around Alex and Weiss seemed to warp and bend further, its boundaries growing less distinct. The once familiar pulsating hum beneath their feet now took on a new, ominous rhythm, like the ticking of a clock counting down to an unknown event. The watchers, who had been silent and motionless for what felt like hours, suddenly became more active, their bodies flickering in and out of focus, like distorted images on a broken screen. It was as if the very essence of this place was growing unstable, or perhaps it was they who were becoming increasingly susceptible to its effects. Despite the overwhelming presence of the watchers, Alex could feel a new sense of urgency in the air. They were standing on the precipice of something larger than they had ever anticipated. The figure had spoken of choice, of facing something deeper than fear. Yet, what were they really choosing? The realization came slowly, creeping into Alex's mind as they walked in silence alongside Weiss. The true test was not whether they could escape the maze, but whether they could confront the part of themselves that had led them here. For the first time, Alex felt the weight of their past choices pressing down on them, the quiet moments of self-doubt and regret rising to the surface. This was not just a test of strength or willpower. It was a test of identity. What did they stand for? Who were they beneath the surface of the life they had constructed? Was there a path forward that wasn't shackled to the ghosts of their past? "We can't just walk in circles forever," Weiss said, her voice trembling but firm. She was the first to break the silence that had stretched between them, like an invisible barrier. "There's got to be more to this, right? Some way out." Her question, though born of frustration, was one Alex had been asking themselves for hours. Hadn't they already walked through enough of this maze? The twisty paths, the dark corridors, the disorienting landscapes. Surely there had to be an end in sight. Yet, the longer they remained in the center of the maze, the more it felt like there was no real path forward, no exit, no solution. Every direction seemed the same. Every choice just another way to spiral deeper into this never-ending cycle of doubt and confusion. But despite the overwhelming sense of being trapped, Something deep inside told Alex that the maze, as incomprehensible as it seemed, was somehow offering them a strange sort of freedom. The more they looked around, the more they realized that this was not a place of captivity, but a place of potential, a space where the impossible could become real. The maze was not confining them. It was waiting for them to create their own path, to make their own decision about what freedom actually meant. Maybe it's not about getting out, Alex mused aloud, speaking before they could fully think through the implications of their words. Maybe it's about accepting that we're here for a reason, and that we can make something of it. The maze, it's a reflection of our choices, right? So, maybe we need to make a choice about what we want to become. Weiss glanced at Alex, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. You think we have the power to change it? To choose our way out? It's not about changing it. It's about choosing how we respond to it, Alex replied. This isn't some test we can pass or fail by simply finding the exit. It's about understanding that the maze itself is our reflection. And until we can understand that, we'll keep running in circles. Weiss hesitated, the weight of Alex's words settling heavily on her shoulders. She looked around them once more, the walls of the maze seeming to close in. But then, she nodded slowly. Okay, so we don't just try to escape it. We have to figure out what it's trying to show us. There was a brief moment of silence between them, where both Alex and Weiss seemed to lose themselves in the stillness of the maze. The watchers had stopped moving entirely, now mere statuesque figures, their blank stares the only sign that they were still observing. It was as if the maze itself had quieted, waiting for the next step. And then, just as Alex began to think they might be on the verge of some revelation, the ground beneath them trembled violently, throwing them both off balance. The pulse that had once been steady now began to quicken, reverberating through the air in sharp, jarring bursts. Before they could steady themselves, the maze began to shift again. The once static walls began to swirl like smoke, bending and twisting in strange, unsettling ways. It was as though the maze was alive, changing in real time, responding to their thoughts and movements. "Alex!" Weiss cried, grabbing onto their arm as the ground seemed to crumble beneath their feet. The air became thick, oppressive, and the once clear path ahead was swallowed by a fog so dense it seemed to have materialized from thin air. Alex's heart raced as they tried to keep their footing, but the maze was no longer a place of silent observation. It had become an entity in its own right, reacting to their presence in ways that were both alien and frightening. They could feel the walls closing in, the space shrinking, as if the maze was trying to compress them into something smaller, more contained. "Stay close," Alex urged, gripping Weiss's hand tightly. They couldn't afford to lose her now. They couldn't afford to lose themselves. As the maze shifted around them, a new form began to emerge from the fog. Another figure. But this one was not like the Watchers or the elusive presence that had spoken before. It was a shape Alex recognized all too well. A reflection of themselves, only warped and distorted, its face twisted in a grotesque mask of their own fears and regrets. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its form mimicking their every action, every gesture. It was an echo, but not just any echo. It was a version of Alex, of everything they had run from, everything they had avoided confronting. "Is this it?" Weiss whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising tension. "Is this what we're meant to face?" Alex could barely speak, the weight of the illusion too great to process. Was this their true test? To confront not just the maze, but the dark reflection of their own self? Before they could answer, the reflection lunged forward, its eyes filled with the same confusion and terror Alex had felt since entering this place. And in that moment, the maze no longer felt like a test of physical endurance or will. It was a test of identity, of confronting the very things they had spent their life running from. The reflection was not a simple enemy. It was them, everything they had buried inside themselves, waiting to be unearthed. The grotesque figure in front of Alex was an embodiment of every fear, regret, and unanswered question they had ever tried to bury. It wasn't just a reflection in the conventional sense. It was a living manifestation of their inner turmoil, each movement mirroring their own, but exaggerated, distorted into something monstrous. Alex felt the weight of it press upon them, an invisible force that left them gasping for air, as though the very essence of their being was being consumed by the sight of this figure. "Is this me?" Alex whispered, more to themselves than to Weiss, their voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. The reflection, no, the entity, in front of them smirked, its twisted version of Alex's face contorting into an expression of mockery. It wasn't just their appearance that had been distorted. It was everything they had ever feared about themselves. The mistakes, the missed opportunities, the unresolved parts of their soul. It felt as though every part of their identity had been laid bare, dissected, and turned into something ugly. Weiss, standing at Alex's side, remained motionless, her eyes locked on the figure. "You have to fight it," she said, though her voice carried an undercurrent of doubt. Was this truly the answer? Was it even possible to fight something so deeply embedded within them? Alex didn't know how to respond. The realization that they were facing their deepest self-doubt was overwhelming. For so long, they had blamed external circumstances, other people, the maze, even fate for their struggles. But standing before this distorted version of themselves, Alex couldn't escape the truth. They had always been their own worst enemy. The maze hadn't created this reflection. It had only revealed what was already inside them. The figure reached out a hand, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. It mirrored Alex's own movements, but there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was confident, comfortable in its existence, while Alex stood paralyzed, struggling to find the strength to even move. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to retreat into the safety of the maze's familiar corridors, but they couldn't. The figure was a part of them, and as much as they wanted to escape, they knew that running wasn't an option. This was the moment of truth, the point where the maze, in all its dark, shifting power, was forcing Alex to confront the one thing they had avoided for so long, themselves. It was no longer about navigating the labyrinth or finding a way out. It was about understanding the complex, often painful aspects of their identity and reconciling with them. There was no easy way out of this. To truly overcome this place, Alex needed to face the reflection head-on, to come to terms with the things they had repressed and left unresolved. But how could they fight something that was so deeply ingrained in their mind? How could they battle an image that was, in its own way, an extension of themselves? The reflection in front of them was a brutal mirror, one that showed not only their failures, but also the part of them that was afraid of truly facing their own potential. It was easy to blame external forces, but now, Alex realized the battle had always been within them. "You're weak," the figure hissed, its voice an unnerving echo of Alex's own. "You can't escape from yourself. You've always known this. All this time, you've been running from what you are." The words cut deeper than anything Alex had anticipated. Every sharp, biting statement was like a stab to the core of their identity. How many times had they told themselves they could push through? How many times had they buried their insecurities beneath layers of pride or distraction? The maze had made them confront what they had tried to hide. But it was only now, in the face of this terrible reflection, that they understood the true nature of the struggle. It wasn't about defeating an external foe. It was about breaking through the barriers they had built around their own heart. "Stop it," Alex muttered under their breath, the words a plea as much as a command. They weren't sure who they were speaking to anymore, the reflection or themselves. "I'm not afraid of you." The reflection laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the maze like the rattling of chains. "You think you're not afraid?" it mocked. "You've spent your whole life running from the truth, from the person you really are. You'll never be free until you face what's inside you." Alex clenched their fists, trying to steady themselves, trying to summon some strength from within. It felt impossible, as though the maze itself was pressing in on them, holding them back. But then, as they looked deeper into the reflection's eyes, something shifted. They saw not just their own fear and doubt, but also a flicker of understanding. This reflection wasn't just a villain. It was a part of them, an aspect of themselves that had been neglected, ignored, and now, finally, had a chance to be acknowledged. "You're right," Alex said, their voice steadier than before. "I've been running, but I'm done running now." The reflection's grin faltered for a brief moment, its smugness wavering as it sensed a shift in Alex's resolve. It recoiled slightly, as if unsure of how to respond. For the first time, it seemed to hesitate, just as Alex had hesitated for so long. They didn't have all the answers, but they knew one thing. They could no longer allow this version of themselves to control them. With a deep breath, Alex took a step forward. It was not a grand gesture, not a leap of defiance, but a simple step into the unknown, into the darkness. The reflection mirrored them, stepping forward in sync, but this time, Alex didn't flinch. The more they stood their ground, the more the reflection seemed to lose its power. It wasn't going to vanish. No, that would be too easy, but it would lose its grip over them. Alex wasn't going to defeat this part of themselves. They were going to embrace it, accept it, and in doing so, begin to move past it. The maze still felt alive around them, the walls trembling, the pulse echoing in their bones. But in that moment, Alex realized that they didn't need to fight the maze itself. They didn't need to fight the reflection. The only battle they had to win was the one within themselves. The maze had been showing them the way all along. It wasn't a place to escape, but a space to grow, to confront the very things that made them who they were. "We can do this," Alex said, their voice stronger now. They turned to Weiss, who stood beside them, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration. "We can face this together." Weiss nodded, though the fear hadn't completely left her eyes. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way through the maze, not by escaping it, but by embracing what it had to teach them. The maze had always felt like a labyrinth of shifting walls. Each step Alex took revealing new corridors, new challenges, new fears. But after their confrontation with the reflection, the monstrous manifestation of their deepest fears, something changed within them. For the first time, Alex felt a flicker of clarity, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this maze than mere escape. The truth, they realized, was not about finding a way out. It was about understanding the maze itself. The walls still pulsed with an unsettling rhythm, the air thick with the scent of decay and desperation. But Alex could no longer allow themselves to be consumed by the suffocating pressure. They had faced their darkest self, the part of them that had always held them back, and had not only survived but stood tall. Now, the walls of the maze seemed less like barriers and more like obstacles. Obstacles to be understood and, if necessary, conquered. Weiss, standing beside Alex, was quiet, her expression thoughtful. She had always been the cautious one, the one to take a step back before diving into something unfamiliar. But now, even she seemed to sense that the game had shifted. There was a new understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer passive players in this twisted game. They were participants, and the maze was no longer an enemy, but a reflection of everything they had yet to understand. "I used to think I could just run," Alex said, breaking the silence. Their voice, though still heavy with the weight of the journey, was steadier now. "I thought if I just kept moving, kept pushing forward, the maze would eventually release me. But it's not like that. There is no escape until you understand why you're here in the first place." Weiss turned to face them, her eyes narrowing as though weighing their words. "So, you think we're supposed to understand the maze? Or is this just another one of those tricks it's playing on us?" "I don't know," Alex admitted. "But I'm starting to think that the more we resist it, the more it digs its claws into us. Maybe the way forward isn't about escaping. Maybe it's about confronting what's keeping us here. Facing it head on." Weiss shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Alex's words settling in. "And how do we do that?" she asked, the skepticism creeping back into her tone. "How do we confront something we don't even understand?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Alex replied. "The reflection showed me that it's not about knowing all the answers. It's about understanding the question. Why are we here? What does this maze want from us?" There was a moment of quiet, the hum of the maze pressing against them like a living entity. Alex had no clear answers, but for the first time, they didn't need them. They had confronted their darkest self, and in doing so, had learned the power of acceptance. The maze, in all its twisted forms, was a reflection of their fears, yes, but it was also a space for growth, a place that forced them to look deeper into the parts of themselves they had long ignored. As they moved deeper into the maze, Alex could feel the shift in their perception. The walls no longer felt like a trap, but a challenge. They were no longer victims of their environment, but participants in a process of revelation. Every turn, every dead end, was an opportunity to learn more, to confront something new. It wasn't easy, and the fears still lingered in the corners of their mind, but Alex knew that there was power in this realization. They were not running away anymore. They were moving through the maze, step by step, with purpose. Weiss, still hesitant, glanced at Alex, sensing the change in their energy. "You really think we can make it out of here?" Not by escaping, but by facing the maze head-on. Alex met her gaze, their expression resolute. "I don't know if we'll make it out the way we think we will. But I do know one thing. The more we understand, the closer we get to the truth. And that's what we need now, the truth." The maze seemed to respond to their words, its pulse quickening, its walls shifting subtly. For a moment, Alex felt a flicker of unease. The maze had a way of reacting to them, adapting to their emotional state, feeding on their fear and uncertainty. But this time, instead of fear, Alex felt something else, a strange sense of clarity. They weren't afraid of the maze anymore. They had begun to see it for what it truly was, not an adversary to defeat, but a lesson to learn. They continued walking, each step taking them further into the depths of the maze. The corridors stretched out before them, endless and twisting. But with each turn, Alex could feel the weight of the labyrinth lifting. It was as though the maze was no longer a force of oppression, but a mirror, a reflection of their journey, their growth, their fears, and their capacity to overcome. And yet, as they moved forward, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sensation of eyes on them, hidden, unseen, lingered at the edge of their awareness, like a shadow stalking them through the winding halls. The maze, with all its complexity and disorienting chaos, had begun to feel less like a physical space and more like an internal landscape. It was as if the maze was reflecting something deeper within them, a part of themselves that they had yet to confront. It was then that Alex realized the maze had not just been a trial of their physical endurance. It was a test of their very psyche. To leave it, they would need to confront not just the maze, but what lay buried beneath it. The walls of the maze, seemingly endless, stretched forward, but now Alex was not so sure that escape was their goal anymore. The truth was, the maze was not something to be feared or run from. It was something to understand, something to move through with purpose. As Alex and Weiss continued their journey through the maze, a strange sense of déjà vu settled over them, like a fog creeping in from the edges of their consciousness. The walls seemed to shift and warp in ways that felt far too familiar, as if the maze was slowly becoming a mirror of something long forgotten. Every turn they made seemed to echo with the whispers of the past, distant voices, muffled sounds, fragments of memories that didn't quite belong to them. Alex felt a growing unease, as though the very fabric of this twisted world was pulling them into a reality they could not fully grasp. They passed through a narrow corridor, the walls closing in as though constricting around them, and suddenly Alex found themselves standing before a door, one that hadn't been there before. It was ornate, heavy, and covered in intricate carvings, the kind of door one might find in an old abandoned mansion. The sudden appearance of the door felt wrong, like a thread pulled too taut, threatening to unravel everything. But something about it beckoned them. They could almost hear faint whispers calling from the other side. "Do you hear that?" Weiss asked quietly, her voice shaky. "It's like someone's trying to speak to us." Alex hesitated, their gaze locked on the door. "I hear it too," they admitted, feeling a cold shiver crawl up their spine. The whispers, so faint at first, seemed to grow louder with each passing second, but there was something unsettling in their rhythm, a slow, deliberate tone that felt less like words and more like a warning. The decision to open the door wasn't made in the usual sense of curiosity or desire to explore. It was more a compulsion, a pull from within, as though the maze itself had directed them here. With a trembling hand, Alex grasped the cold, metal handle and pushed the door open, the heavy creak of the hinges echoing through the stillness. What lay beyond was not the familiar, disorienting maze they had come to know. Instead, they were met with an expansive room, its high ceilings lost in shadow. The air felt thick and oppressive, as though it had not been disturbed for years. And yet, in the center of the room was a large mirror, gleaming and perfect, standing tall against the far wall. It was out of place in this decaying, shifting world. The mirror seemed too real, too tangible, and Alex couldn't tear their gaze away from it. Weiss, who had been hesitant to enter, took a cautious step forward. "What is this place?" she whispered, as though afraid the very walls might answer her question. Her words, however, were drowned out by the rising hum that now filled the room. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation, like the vibrations of something deep within the earth, something primal and ancient. Alex stepped closer to the mirror, their reflection growing clearer with each step. But as they drew nearer, they began to notice something strange. The reflection was wrong. It was not just a simple reflection. It was distorted, shifting in subtle ways that didn't make sense. Their own face was twisted, as if the mirror was pulling from their innermost thoughts and fears, creating a version of themselves they could barely recognize. It was an unsettling distortion, one that seemed to mirror the horrors they had faced in the maze, but in a far more intimate, personal way. "I don't think we should look too long," Weiss said, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right." But Alex couldn't look away. The reflection was changing, showing them scenes from their past, memories that they had long buried, long forgotten. Faces of people they had known, places they had been, moments of their life that seemed disconnected from the maze. The more they stared, the more the mirror seemed to pull at the edges of their reality, blurring the lines between what was real and what was imagined. It was as though the mirror wasn't just showing them their reflection. It was revealing the very fabric of their existence, the choices, the regrets, the moments they had left behind. For a split second, Alex thought they saw something in the reflection that wasn't their own, another figure, a shadow moving behind them. But when they turned around, there was nothing there, just the heavy silence of the room pressing in on them. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Weiss asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something moved behind you." Alex nodded, their heart pounding in their chest. "It was there. I swear it was. But when I turned around, nothing was there." The mirror, for all its unsettling power, seemed to pulse with life, as though it was more than just glass and reflection. It was a portal, a window into something far more sinister. Alex could feel it now, the pull of the past, the way the maze had been built on their own memories and regrets. The truth was, the maze wasn't just a physical space. It was a manifestation of their own subconscious, a labyrinth created not by the maze itself, but by the dark corners of their mind that they had never dared to confront. The reflection in the mirror twisted again, this time showing Alex a vision from their childhood, a house, an old house on the outskirts of the city. It was a place they had long forgotten, a place they had thought to be a distant memory. But there it was, clear as day, standing before them in the mirror, as though mocking them for ever thinking they could escape it. "Why is this here?" Alex murmured, feeling their legs go weak beneath them. "What does it want from me?" Weiss placed a hand on Alex's shoulder, grounding them as the room seemed to close in around them. "I don't know," she said softly, "but we have to face it. We have to face whatever it is." The mirror's reflection shimmered one last time before it cracked, the glass splintering outward, and for a brief moment, Alex felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. They didn't know what the mirror was or why it had shown them these images, but they understood one thing. It was a reminder. The maze, the reflections, the horrors, they were all connected to their past. To leave, Alex had to confront the darkness buried deep within them. Only then would the maze release them. And as the last shard of the mirror fell to the floor, Alex knew that the answers they sought were no longer in the maze itself, but in the untold stories of their own past, waiting to be uncovered. The shattering of the mirror was not the end, but merely the beginning of the next phase in Alex and Weiss's journey. The room, once full of shadows and whispers, had now fallen into an unsettling silence. The remnants of the mirror lay scattered across the floor, the jagged shards reflecting distorted glimpses of their surroundings. But Alex didn't have time to focus on the broken glass. Their mind was still reeling from the haunting images they had seen within it. The house from their childhood, the long-buried memories, the flickering shadow that had seemed to move behind them. What had it all meant? The maze had grown even more unpredictable, twisting in ways that felt like a reflection of Alex's own psyche. They could sense it now, the walls pressing in, moving, pulsating with a life of their own. It was as though the maze was aware of them, adapting to their fears and anxieties, a living, breathing entity that fed off their doubts. Every step they took felt like a step deeper into a world they couldn't fully understand, a world where logic no longer applied, and the line between reality and illusion was blurred beyond recognition. "Do you think we should go back?" Weiss asked, her voice trembling slightly. She had stepped away from the mirror's remnants, but the uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her own inner turmoil. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and contract as if responding to her question. But Alex, despite the chaos in their mind, shook their head. "There's no going back now," they said firmly. "The only way out is forward." And so, they pressed on, stepping carefully through the room, past the broken glass and into the next corridor. This path was unlike any they had encountered before. The air was colder here, and the silence was even more profound, as though the very walls had been drained of all sound. The hallway stretched endlessly before them, lit only by the faint, flickering glow of lights that seemed to pulse in time with their footsteps. As they walked, Alex began to notice something strange. The walls weren't just shifting around them, they were changing in real time. One moment, the corridor was lined with old, crumbling bricks, and the next, the walls were smooth and metallic, with strange markings etched into the surface. It was as if the maze was reshaping itself, actively responding to their presence. The further they went, the more the maze began to feel like an entity, alive, conscious, and malevolent. Are we being watched?" Weiss whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex nodded grimly. "It feels like it, doesn't it?" The hairs on the back of their neck stood up as they quickened their pace. Something was wrong. They could feel it. Something was lurking in the dark corners of this place, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, they came to a stop before a large door, one that had appeared without warning in the midst of the ever-shifting maze. It was unlike the others they had encountered. No carvings, no symbols, just a plain, heavy door that seemed almost too mundane for this bizarre and otherworldly place. But the door had an undeniable presence, a weight that felt both familiar and foreign. It was as though it had been waiting for them. Alex reached for the handle and turned it slowly. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed unerringly through the maze, a sound that felt like it was reaching into the very core of their being. Beyond the door was nothingness, a void that stretched into infinity, an empty, featureless expanse that seemed to swallow up all light. It was as though the door had opened to nowhere, to a place outside the bounds of time and space. "We should turn back," Weiss said, her voice rising in panic. But Alex shook their head again, more decisively this time. "This is it. We have to go through." With that, they stepped forward, leaving the solid ground of the maze behind them and entering the void. The moment they crossed the threshold, everything changed. The air turned cold, suffocating, and the space around them seemed to fold in on itself, the walls collapsing into an endless black abyss. The door they had just passed through disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Alex and Weiss were now standing on a narrow bridge that stretched out into the nothingness, with no visible ground beneath them, no horizon in sight. It was as though they were suspended in a void that existed outside of reality itself. "Where are we?" Weiss whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Alex didn't know how to answer. There was no clear explanation, no rational answer. All they could see was the abyss stretching endlessly in all directions, an emptiness that felt both infinite and suffocating. The bridge beneath them was the only thing connecting them to anything resembling stability. Then, something shifted in the distance. At first, it was just a flicker, a tiny pinprick of light in the far reaches of the void. But as Alex focused on it, the light began to grow, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. It wasn't just a light, it was a shape, a figure, emerging from the darkness, as though drawn toward them by some invisible force. "We need to go back," Weiss urged again, but Alex stood frozen, staring at the figure. It was moving closer now, a figure cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the same darkness that surrounded them. The closer it came, the more Alex felt that strange compulsion to move forward. It was as if the figure was calling to them, beckoning them into the abyss. "Oh, what is that?" Weiss asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Alex said, their voice tight with a growing sense of dread. "But I think it's the key. We need to face it. We need to see what it wants." The figure was now close enough that they could make out its shape. A tall, thin silhouette, with eyes that glowed like molten embers. It was no longer just a figure in the distance. It was here, standing before them, waiting for them to take the next step. And in that moment, Alex realized that the maze had not been leading them to an exit. It had been leading them to this figure, to whatever it represented. It was the culmination of their journey, the force that had been pulling them through the twists and turns of the labyrinth all along. To escape, to truly escape, they had to confront this entity. Whatever it was, whatever it wanted, Alex had no choice but to face it. As Alex and Weiss stepped into the light, they were no longer the same people who had entered the maze so many weeks ago. The transformation had been slow, imperceptible at first, but undeniable now. Their journey through the labyrinth of their minds had been a struggle, a battle against themselves and the darkness they had spent years avoiding. But standing in the light, they realized something profoundly simple. They had never truly been trapped at all. The maze was a reflection of their own fear, their inability to confront the aspects of themselves they had hidden away. And now, that fear had been faced, accepted, and ultimately transcended. The world around them was different. It wasn't the physical environment that had changed, but their perception of it. The oppressive darkness that had once suffocated them had lifted, replaced by a clarity they had never known before. The city's skyline stretched out before them, familiar yet distant, as though they were seeing it with new eyes. The noise of the bustling streets, the hum of traffic, and the distant chatter of people felt like a distant echo, as though they had transcended the limits of the urban world and entered something deeper, something more meaningful. For the first time, Alex could breathe without the weight of their past bearing down on them. It was as if the walls they had built around their psyche had crumbled, and in their place stood something stronger, an open space where growth, acceptance, and self-awareness could thrive. The shadows that had loomed so large in their mind were now nothing more than fleeting thoughts, no longer holding dominion over them. The sense of terror that had once paralyzed them was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that felt like a rebirth. Weiss, too, seemed transformed. Her once rigid posture had softened, and there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. She had always been the one to search for answers, to fight for control, but now she understood that control was an illusion. True strength, she realized, came not from forcing things into place, but from allowing oneself to flow with the currents of life. She had learned to trust herself, to trust Alex, and to trust the process. And in doing so, she had found a peace she never thought possible. They walked together side by side through the streets of New York City. The hustle and bustle of the city seemed like a distant memory, as though it belonged to another world. Yet, in this new reality, it was clear that they no longer felt out of place. The city no longer represented the oppressive, chaotic force it once had been. Instead, it was simply a backdrop for their own transformation. Life moved on, but they had found a new rhythm, one that was not bound by fear or confusion. The more Alex and Weiss moved forward, the more they realized that their journey had only just begun. The maze had been a microcosm of their internal struggle, a battle between their past selves and the people they had become. But the real work, the real challenge, was now in the present moment. The maze had been the first step in understanding who they truly were, but their lives from here on out would be about living in alignment with that truth. No longer running from their fears, they would walk forward with eyes wide open, ready to face whatever came their way. There were no grand gestures, no miraculous moments of divine intervention. The resolution came not from the external world, but from within. Alex and Weiss had discovered that the answers they sought had always been inside them, hidden beneath layers of fear, guilt, and doubt. In accepting those parts of themselves, they had unlocked the potential for true freedom. The labyrinth, with all its twists and turns, had been a reflection of their journey towards self-realization. And now, with the maze behind them, they stood at the threshold of a new chapter in their lives, one where they would finally be able to move forward without the weight of their past holding them back. It was easy to mistake their newfound peace for an end. It felt like a conclusion, a story wrapping itself up with a neat and tidy bow. But in reality, it was only the beginning of a much larger narrative, one that had no clear endpoint. Life, after all, was not a destination but a journey, and Alex and Weiss had only just begun to understand that. They had reached a place where they no longer needed to fear the unknown, where they could embrace whatever came next with open hearts and minds. In that moment, standing in the heart of New York City, Alex felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had faced their darkest fears and emerged stronger, more resilient than ever before. The shadow that had haunted them was no longer an adversary, but a part of their own story, a symbol of the struggles they had overcome. And while they knew there would be more challenges ahead, they also understood that they were no longer alone in facing them. They had each other, and they had themselves. As the sun began to set behind the city skyline, casting a warm glow over the streets, Alex and Weiss looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They had made it through the maze, but the real journey, the one that would define who they were, was just beginning. With the lessons of the past now firmly ingrained in their hearts, they were ready to face the world with courage, compassion, and a sense of peace that would carry them through whatever came next. They had found their way out, but now they would live as if they were truly free.